Welcome to a new edition of the Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino. On this episode, we talk with author, speaker, and business advisor Ian Williams. His humanitarian and environmental values were shaped by the landscapes of Minnesota during his youth. Then a single mystical experience transformed his life at the age of 24. A decade of spiritual immersion, substance abuse recovery, and self-discovery revealing a fundamental truth: reviving ourselves is the only path to reviving the planet. Ian believes that in order to address the grand challenges of our time, we need individuals to do their own deep internal work. When this happens, people can lead with their own unique genius. We get into all of this and so much more. Enjoy this interview.
Well, nice to meet you. Thanks for taking a minute out for the show today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure. So before we get into your life, a very busy life as an author and speaker and advisor, I want to know how you survived COVID. The last couple of years has been quite tumultuous, and now that the world's opening up, how did you survive that time period, and how has it subsequently changed the way that you approach life and business?
That's a great question. Well, I feel very fortunate to have survived COVID at all. It was, we can certainly say that there are many people who did not escape that era. But also in some ways, it really improved my quality of life as someone who identifies as being, pretty introverted and introspective. And it drastically changed the trajectory of my professional life as well. When COVID began, I was still in education, and I actually went back to graduate school during COVID and completed graduate school still during COVID. But I was in education, and eventually, I went back to school in order to build a business. And so I built that business, and now I'm off, consulting, speaking, teaching, all of these things. So it really did, I think for many people, it was a drastic change, in directions, and it certainly was for me. And I feel very fortunate, to have experienced a lot of blessings in the last couple of years, actually.
So let's simplify what you do for a living. There's a lot that goes into it, but I'm going to take you in front of a bunch of third graders at a career day, and one of them looks up at you and says, "What do you do for a living?" How would you answer them?
Yeah. I speak and teach on personal and spiritual development. That's about half of what I do. And the other half of what I do is I help mission-driven companies build healthier cultures, so healthier people, employee well-being, employee engagement, and have a greater impact on the world. Try and increase the impact of their mission as a mission-driven company.
Talk to me a little bit about how these seeds were sprinkled. You like how in your childhood do you feel like you got these motivations to become who you are? And let's take you back to the third grade. What did you want to do when you grew up?
I was not one of those kids who really knew what I wanted to do when I grew up. It wasn't like the firefighter or the basketball player or the police officer or anything like that. I never really identified strongly with any sort of particular career goal, in that sense. That being said, I had wonderful parents who were both educators themselves. And, so I grew up in a household that was very open to discussions on all sorts of different topics. And that definitely helped shape who I am. And, as I think about my mother and my father and how their personal values are kind of, still living through me in a sense. My father is an intellect, a scholar, definitely into politics, which is that apple did not, I didn't pick up that gene, but really interested in dialogue and exploring things intellectually. And my mother is very sensitive, very caring, and also very kind of nature environmental focused. And those two things I really did bring with me, and they've really influenced my work now. So as a kid, I didn't really have a specific direction or a dream, but as I think about how all of these things have kind of progressed, I've kind of fused the personal and spiritual development with nature and environment into business. And it took me it took me many years to figure out how to do that. But those are really kind of the core values that drive my work and also really drive me as a person. I mean, I fundamentally believe that the best way to change the world is, from the inside out. And it's each of us doing our own individual, deep internal work to self-actualize so that we can show up as healthier, happier individuals in the world around us. And so I think those are some of the things that I internalized as a kid. And then as I went through my own, adolescence and young adulthood kind of transition process, that those are things that kind of manifested in my work as well.
What about role models or heroes? Who have been those for you that's really inspired you to proceed and to succeed in your life?
I think if I were to think about, again, I would say I didn't really have a lot of those people who were, maybe like famous or in the public eye. I definitely had those people in my personal life that I look up to. For mother and father, for one, I was really close with my grandfather on my mom's side. And he, also kind of had these humanitarian values. And so I think what I learned from particularly family was the importance of caring. And then, there were a couple authors along the way. Daniel Quinn wrote a book, Ishmael, which is about a spiritual journey. And that's one of the very few novels that I have reread several times in life. I believe James Redford wrote The Celestine Prophecy. That was a novel that I have reread. I'm typically not a fiction reader. I prefer nonfiction for the most part, but there's a few novels that I think I kind of looked up to, and it was a way to, I don't want to say like lose myself or disappear, but it was a way to, I think, be in a space where I actually felt more comfortable. I've always kind of identified as someone who's, more philosophical in nature, always kind of leaning towards the spiritual aspects of life, the mystical aspects of life. And so I felt like growing up, it was easier to connect to that world through reading than it was necessarily through anything else. And at this point, I feel really blessed. There's so many people who I feel like I look up to and follow, and am fortunate enough to have, the opportunity to work with. And there's a lot of people, but I really, it may sound like a little bit of a cliche, but there's a common phrase out there, something to the effect of when you learn how to listen, the whole world becomes your teacher. And that's something that I really try and practice on a day-to-day basis. Everyone out there has something to teach. We all have unique qualities. And I do really feel like it's my responsibility to hold myself in a way that allows me to see the teacher in other people, what everyone has to offer, for good or for bad, so to speak. And so I feel really fortunate, but, again, it's not a very sexy answer in terms of, there weren't a lot of people who I wanted to, be like Mike or, any of the kind of famous athletes or actors or anything like that growing up. Those weren't necessarily my idols growing up.
No, that's a great answer. Absolutely. That gets to the root of things. So I guess we'll throw a different shade on this here. If you could meet anybody alive on the planet right now, who would it be? Who would you love to talk to?
A couple people come to mind. I would say both of them are spiritual leaders. Sadhguru is someone that I would be fascinated to sit down and have tea with. I'm not even sure we'd chat, just be nice to sit together. I really feel inspired by the work that he does at the scale that he does it at. His humanitarian and environmental initiatives and instructing others in personal and spiritual development is something that is astonishing and something to admire. And there's a Taoist author watching me, and I've read a couple of his books over the years as well, and I think he'd be fascinating to sit down with as well. So they're definitely both spiritual leaders in my book.
Speaking of motivation, what is it that motivates you? You know, every day we have things that we do, things that we want to get done. What is it that A, motivates you, and B, what's a successful day? At the end of the day, what makes you feel the happiest?
The thing that motivates me is having a positive impact, contributing to the common good. And at the end of the day, it's committing to what matters most. So I think, that's my short answer. My longer answer is I've done a lot of self-reflection over the years to figure out what those things are, right? And how my makeup, skill set can best serve the greater good. And I've gone back and forth over the years, to figure out what that looks like. At one point, I thought it was, becoming a therapist. At another point, I thought it was becoming an environmentalist and, really kind of getting my hands in the dirt and doing the regenerative work from an ecological perspective. And it took a long time to realize that at heart, I'm an educator. And so teaching is really a number one gift for me. And I love being in a learning environment, and I love turning other people on to their own self-discovery process, and holding space for that. Because I think, particularly in the culture that I grew up in, the society that I grew up in, it wasn't necessarily something that was promoted or honored, oftentimes really not even acknowledged. And to be able to hold space for other people who are, again, really doing that deep internal work, and hopefully provide some guidance for people who are, searching for answers or ideas that might help them move through that process internally, is a really sacred space. And so that, I would say, that's really what motivates me, is providing individuals with the opportunity to do that. And I think that's more on a personal sense. From a professional kind of consulting oriented work, I'm extremely passionate about climate change. I think it is the grandest challenge that we have to solve. There are many other grand challenges that we as a species really need to kind of own up to and face. But, if we don't figure out the climate change thing, we're going to have a lot more issues down the road. And so I'm really passionate about that. And in terms of the organizations, the mission-driven organizations that I like working with, that I referenced earlier, I love working with organizations that are trying to tackle big challenges. And oftentimes those are, quickly growing organizations that are trying to keep up with the pace at which they are scaling, and the opportunity to kind of really, get in the trenches with them and help them make sense of that and build healthy culture and support, employee well-being and employee engagement along the way is something that also really motivates me. To the second half of your question about, how do I define success at the end of the day? It's doing what matters most. And again, it's taken a lot of thought and deciphering to figure out what does that look like. But at the end of the day, I've kind of boiled it down to a few, core pieces that really define success for me right now. In the past, it was just figuring out what is my work. And so moving through that process and, really trying to figure out how to fit the puzzle pieces together was probably my most important work, I would say, over the last 5 to 10 years. Now I really feel like it's finding opportunities to actualize on that work. So whether it's, speaking on podcasts, whether it's having conversations with people, whether it's producing content, which is something that I'm just trying to get back into after being in graduate school and not having a whole lot of time to do it, or whether it's, prospecting and working with clients. There's a few things at the top of my list that I really try and make sure that I take care of every day from an outward perspective, but all of those things are also built upon a foundation of personal health and well-being. I've learned the lesson time and again over the years. If I'm not taking care of myself, I just have less to offer. And so I really feel like that personal health, well-being, self-discovery is the bedrock, the foundation. Everything else is built on top of that.
So what has been one of the best, fan letters, responses that you've gotten back from any work you've done? Something that you just remember on the top of the list?
I'm fortunate enough to work closely with a lot of business leaders and employees. And honestly, one of the most rewarding things for me to hear is for people to say something to the effect of, I feel like I got my life back. I was just working with a client this morning who said, moving into 2023, I really am going to be prioritizing my family and my marriage. And it's not necessarily about, achieving drawdown or social impact. Those things are really, really important. But the thing that really motivates me, that I get really excited about, and oftentimes, even brings me to tears, is people having those realizations. I now have the time and the space to invest in my well-being, to invest in my family, to invest in the community, because I'm no longer just putting out fires every day at work. I'm not working 80, 100-hour weeks anymore. I have a manageable workload. My systems are in place. We're building a healthy culture. The team is functioning healthily, and we're all moving along. We're firing on all cylinders. And that gives me the opportunity to go figure out what greater impact I have. And that, is really intentionally baked into my working model. So when I'm working with organizations, I often say there's 3 phases. The first phase is not always, but it's often process optimization. We're just working on the organization's operations to try and make sure that we can minimize the amount of dumpster fires that crop up on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis. From that phase, we move into employee engagement and well-being to really try and build a healthy culture, because, the data is very clear. Healthy people are more productive. They're more creative. They enjoy going to work. They're willing to, go the extra mile. But it doesn't necessarily need to be kind of an extractive relationship where they're giving to the company, but the company's not reciprocating that. The third phase is focusing on social and environmental impact. And I really feel like if we can design healthy, intentional organizations and cultures, the social and environmental impact happens almost by default, by people having these realizations of saying, look, I'm going to invest more time with my family, or I'm going to invest more time in my health. And I really think that those are the things that move the needle. You might call it in a more intangible way, but I think they're really, really important. It's not just about the dollars and the cents at the end of the day. It's about, what's the quality of life. And the more people that we can turn on to higher quality of life and more service to themselves and their family and their community, I think the more that's going to spread like wildfire, and the more people are going to be inspired to do that work themselves. So in terms of, fan letters and support, it's those personal stories, those personal epiphanies that I get to witness. I feel very fortunate to be able to witness those on a regular basis. And that's what means the most to me in my work, definitely.
So everyone out there has a perception of you, your family, your friends, your clients, but ultimately you live your life. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
I shy away from labels because I find that over-identifying with any one thing creates rigidity in terms of how one perceives the world or interprets the world or experiences the world. I heard a phrase a couple of years ago, mindset is the mother of action. And I feel like that was, I feel it's very true, from a work and productivity standpoint. From a personal identity standpoint, I guess I would just say I'm someone who's really committed to the self-discovery process. All of the best things in my life have come from diving deep and trying to push those boundaries internally, right? To turn the things that I might look at in the past as a hindrance or a negative personality trait into something that sparks growth. And so, if you go on the website and you read the bios, author, speaker, business advisor, consultant, but I always feel really uncomfortable with the labels, because I feel like they reduce so many people to something that is not as holistic as it could be. And so, maybe that's a frustrating, not a very sexy answer for you, but I oftentimes try and avoid saying this is who I am, because the other thing that I have learned over the years is who I am is continuously changing. I really feel like change is one of the very few constants in life. That and death are the only two things that are guaranteed as far as I can tell. And so the opportunity to, really kind of sink into a specific identity is something that I try to practice awareness around, and not get too overly identified with any one or multiple identities.
Give me an idea. Everybody can go out to see more about you and your services and what you do.
Yeah, I would say, if they're interested in learning more about the personal and spiritual development aspects of life, or my work, www.reviveyouandi.com. It's revive, the letter U, ANDI.com. That's really kind of the hub for my speaking and teaching. And then if they want to learn more about consulting, business advising, that's stillpointinsight.com. So that's where I'm working with mission-driven organizations, helping them increase impact and organizational culture, www.stillpointinsight.com. If people want to find me on social media, that's at ReviveYouAndI on all of the kind of major social media channels. Those accounts have been mostly dormant for the last couple of years just because there's been a lot of change, right? To circle back to the beginning of the conversation, COVID was a big pivot for all of us. And so I did get a little bit away from my social media accounts. But that being said, you can find me there as well.
Wonderful, Ian. Hey, thank you for taking time out and opening up. I really appreciate it, man.
Absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity, Bill. Thanks for the work you're doing, the great questions, and hopefully members in the audience got some value out of the call today.
Thanks for tuning in to another famous interview with Joe Dimino, where we cover the world of art, literature, business, spirituality, and music from around the globe. If you want to hear more interviews, visit the Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino channel on YouTube. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.